The Birmingham mystery. The man in the corner rubbed his chin thoughtfully and looked out upon the busy street below. I suppose, he said, there's some truth in the saying that the Providence watches over bankrupts, kittens, and lawyers. I didn't know there was such a thing as saying, I replied, with a guarded dignity. Isn't there? Perhaps I'm misquoting. Anyway, there should be. Kittens, it seems, live and thrive through social and domestic upheavals which would annihilate the self-supporting tomcat. And today I read the morning papers at the account of a noble lord's bankruptcy, and in the social ones at his visits at the house of cabinet minister, where he is the most honored guest. As for lawyers, when Providence had exhausted all other means of securing their welfare, it has brought forth the peerage cases. I believe, as a matter of fact, that the special dispensation of Providence, as you call it, requires more technical knowledge than any other legal complication that comes before the law courts, I said. And also a great deal more money in the client's pocket than any other complication. Now, take the Lockspeed percentage case. Have you any idea how much money was sent over the soap bubble, which only bursts after many hundreds, if not thousands of pounds went into lawyers' and counsel's fees? I suppose a great deal of money was spent on both sides, I said, until that sudden, awful issue. Which settled the dispute effectively, he interrupted with a dry chuckle. Of course, it is doubtful that any reputable solicitor had taken up the case. Timothy Bedingfield, the Birmingham lawyer, is a gentleman who, well, has had some misfortune, shall we say. He is still on the rolls, mind you, but I doubt if any case would have its chances improved by his conducting it. Against that, there is just this to be said. Some of these old peerages have such peculiar histories and own such wonderful archives that the claim is always worth investigating. You never know what may be the rights of it. I believe that, at first, everyone laughed over the pretensions of the Honourable Ron Ingram de Grimsville to the joint of the part revenues of the old barony of Grimsville, but obviously he might have got his case. It certainly sounded almost like a fairy tale, a claim based upon the supposed validity of an ancient document over 400 years old. It was then that a medieval Lord de Genville, more endowed with muscle than common sense, became during his turbulent existence much embarrassed and hopelessly puzzled through the presentation made to him by his lady of twin-born sons. His embarrassment chiefly arose from the fact that the lady's attendants, while ministering the comforts of the mother, had, in a moment of absent-mindedness, so placed 2 infants under their cots that subsequently not one, not even, perhaps least of all, the mother, could tell which one was which, had been first to make his appearance into this troublesome and puzzling world. After many years of cogitation, during which the Lord de Gainesville approached nearer to the grave and his sons to a man's estate, he gave up trying to solve the riddle as to which of the twins should succeed in his title and revenues. He appealed to his liege lord and King Edward IV of that name, and with the latter's august sanction he drew up a certain document wherein he enacted that both his sons should, after his death, share his titles and godly revenues, and that the first son born in wedlock of either father should subsequently be the sole heir. In this document was also added that if the future time should any Lord de Guerin be similarly affected with twin sons, who had equal rights to be considered the eldest son, the same rule should apply in his succession. Subsequently, Lord de Guinevere was created Earl of Brocklesey by one of the Stuart kings, but 400 years after its enacted the extraordinary deed of succession remained, a mere tradition. The Countesses of Brocklesby having seemingly no prediction for twins. But in 1878, the mistress of Brocklesby Castle presented her lord with two twin-born sons. Fortunately, in modern times, science is more wide awake and attendants more careful. Twin brothers did not get mixed up, and one of them was styled Viscount Sherlock, and the other was heir to the earldom, whilst the other, born 2 hours later, was that fascinating, dashing young guardsman, well known at Hurlington, Goodwood, and London, and in his own country, the Honourable Robert Ingram de Genneville. It certainly was an evil day for the brilliant young scion of the ancient race when he lent an ear to Timothy Bedingfield. This man, and his family before him, had been solicitors of the Earls of Brocklesby for many generations, but Timothy, owing his certain irregularities, had forfeited the confidence of his client, the late Earl. He was still in practice at Birmingham, however, and, of course, knew the ancient family tradition of twin succession. Whether he was prompted by revenge or merely self-advertisement, no one knows. Certain it is that he did advise the Honourable Robert de Genneville, who apparently had more debts than he conveniently could pay, and more extravagant tastes than he could gratify on a younger portions, to lay a claim on his father's death unto the joint title of moiety of the revenues of the ancient barony of Grenville, that claim being based upon the validity of the 15th century document. You may gather how extensive were the pretensions of the Honourable Roberts from the fact that the greater part of Edbation is now built upon the land belonging to the old barony. Anyway, it is the last straw of the ocean of debts and difficulties, and I have no doubt that Bedingfield had not much trouble in persuading the Honourable Roberts to commence litigation at once. The young Earl of Brockingsley's attitude, however, remained one of absolute quietude in his 9 points of the law. He was in possession of both the title and of the document. It was for one side of the force to produce the one to share the other. It was at this stage of the proceedings that the Honourable Roberts had advised to marry, in order to secure, if possible, the first male heir of the generation, since the young Earl himself was still a bachelor. A suitable fiancée was found for him by his friends in the person of Miss Mabel Brandon, the daughter of a rich Birmingham manufacturer, and the marriage was fixed to take place at Birmingham on Thursday, September 15th. On the 13th, the Honourable Robert Ingram de Genneville arrived at the Castle Hotel on New Street for his wedding, and on the 14th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, he was discovered lying on the floor of his bedroom, murdered. The sensation in which the awful and unexpected sequel to the de Genneville peerage caused the minds of the friends of both litigants was a crime unparalleled. I don't think the crime of modern times created such a stir in all classes of society. Birmingham was wild with excitement. The employees of the Castle Hotel had real difficulty in keeping off any eager, inquisitive crowd who thronged daily to the hall, vainly hoping to gather details of news gathering to the related tragedy. At present, there was little to tell. The shrieks of the chambermaid who had gone into the Honourable Robert's room with his shaving water at 8 o'clock had attracted some of the waiters. Soon the manager and his secretary came up, and immediately sent for the police. It seemed at first sight as if the young man had been the victim of a homicidal maniac, so brutal had been the way in which he had been assassinated. The head and body were battered and bruised by some heavy stick or poker, almost past human shape, as if the murderer had wished to wreak some awful vengeance upon the body of the victim. In fact, it would be impossible to recount the gruesome aspect of that room and of any murdered man's body, such as the police and the medical officer took notes of that day. It was supposed that the murder had been committed before the evening. The victim was dressing in his evening clothes, and all the lights in the room had been left on. Robbery also must have had a share in the miscreant's motives, for the drawers and cupboards of the portmanteau and dressing bag had been ransacked as if in search of valuables. On the floor there lay a pocketbook, torn in half and only containing a few letters addressed to the Honourable Robert de Ginsville. The Earl of Brocklesby, next of kin to the deceased, was also telegraphed for. He drove from Broxley Castle, which was about 7 miles from Birmingham. He was terribly afflicted by the awfulness of the tragedy, and offered a liberal reward to stimulate the activity of the police in search of the miscreants. The inquest was fixed for the 17th, 3 days later, and the public was left wondering where the solution lay in the terrible and gruesome murder of the Castle Hotel. Part 2. The central figure of the coroner's court that day was undoubtedly the Earl of Brocklesby, in deep black, which constrained strongly his florid complexion and his fair hair. Sir Marmaduke Ingersoll, his solicitor, was with him, and had already performed the painful duty of identifying the deceased with his brother. This had been an exceedingly painful duty, owing to the terrible mutilated state of the body and the face. But the clothes and various trinkets he wore, including a signet ring, had unfortunately not tempered the brutal assassin, and it was through them chiefly that Lord Brocklesby was able to swear to the identity of his brother. The various employees of the hotel gave evidence as to the discovery of the body, and the medical officer gave his opinion as to the immediate cause of death. The deceased had evidently been struck at the back of the head with a poker or very heavy stick. The murderer then venting his blind fury upon the body, battering his face and bruising it in a way that certainly suggested the work of a maniac. Then the Earl of Brocklesby was called, and requested by the coroner to state when he had last seen his brother alive. The morning before his death, replied his lordship. He came up to Birmingham by early train, and I drove up from Brocklesby to see him. I got to the hotel at 11 o'clock and stayed with him for about an hour. And that is the last you saw of the deceased? That is the last I saw of him, replied Lord Brocklesby. He seemed to hesitate for a moment or two, as if in thought whether he should speak up or not, and then to suddenly make up his mind to speak, for he added, I stayed in town the whole of the next day, and only drove back to Brocklesby late in the evening. I had some business to transact, and put up the Grand, as I usually do, and dined with some friends. Would you tell us by what time you returned to Brocklesby Castle? I think it must have been about 11 o'clock. It is a 7-mile drive from here. I believe, said the coroner after a slight pause, during which the attention of all of the spectators was riveted upon the handsome figure of the young man as he stood in the witness box, the very personification of a high-bred gentleman. I believe that I'm right in stating that there was an unfortunate legal dispute between your lordship and your brother. That is so. The coroner stroked his chin thoughtfully for a moment, then added, in the event of the deceased's claim to the joint title and revenues of de Genneville being good held in the courts of law, there would be great importance, would there not, attached to his marriage, which was to have taken place on the 15th. It is, in that event, there certainly would be. Is the jury to understand, then, that you and the deceased parted on amicable terms after your interview with him? The Earl of Brocklesby hesitated again for a moment or two. The crowd of the jury hung breathless upon his lips. There's no enmity between us, he replied at last. From which we may gather that there might have been, shall I say, a slight disagreement at the interview. My brother had unfortunately been misled by the misrepresentations and perhaps too optimistic views of his lawyer. He had been dragged into litigation on the strength of an old family document which he had never seen or whatsoever as antiquated, and owing to certain wording in it invalid, I thought it would be kinder and more considerate, therefore, to let my brother judge of the document himself. I knew that when he had seen it, he would be convinced of the absolute futility and basis of his claim, and that it would be a terrible disappointment to him. But this is the reason why I wish to see him myself about it, rather than to do it through more formal, perhaps more correct, medium of our respective lawyers. I place the facts before him, and with my part, a perfectly amicable spirit. The young Earl of Bartleby had made this somewhat lengthy, perfectly voluntary explanation of the state of affairs in a calm, quiet voice, with much dignity and perfect simplicity. But the coroner did not seem impressed by it, for he asked, very dryly, "Did you part as friends?" "On my side, absolutely so." "But not his?" insisted the coroner. "I think he felt naturally annoyed by that he had been so ill-advised by his solicitors." "And you made no attempts later on in the day to just any ill feeling that you may have existed between you and him?" asked the coroner, marking with strange, earnest emphasis on every word he uttered. "If you mean did I go and see my brother again that day, no, I did not." "And your lordship, can you give us no further information which might throw some light upon the mystery which surrounds the Honorable Robert Grenville's death?" still persisted the coroner. "I'm sorry, I cannot," replied Earl Broxley with firm decision. The coroner still looked puzzled and thoughtful. It seemed at first as if he wished to press the point further. Everyone felt some deep import had been lain behind this examination of the witness, and all were tentative hooks as to what evidence might bring forth. The Earl of Brockelsby had waited a minute or two, and then, at a sign from the coroner, had left the witness box in order to have a talk with his solicitor. At first he paid no attention to the depositions of the cashier and the hall porter of the Castle Hotel. Gradually it seemed to strike him that curious statements were being made by these witnesses, and a frown of anxious wonder had settled upon his brows, whilst his young face lost some of its florid hue. Mr. Tremlett, the cashier of the hotel, had been holding the attention of the court. He stated that the Honorable Robert Ingram de Grenville had arrived at the hotel at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 13th. He had the room which was usually occupied when he came to the castle, namely number 21, and he went up immediately on his arrival, ordering some breakfast to be brought up to him. At 11 o'clock the Earl of Brockelsby called to see his brother, and remained with him until about 12. In the afternoon the deceased went out and returned for his dinner at 7 o'clock, in company of a gentleman whom the cashier knew well by sight, Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer of Paradise Street. The gentlemen had their dinner downstairs, and after that they went up to the Honorable Mr. de Grenville's room for coffee and cigars. "I could not say at the time Mr. Bedingfield left," the cashier, "but I rather fancy I saw him in the hall about 9:15 p.m. He was wearing an Inverness cape over his dress clothes and a Glengarry cap. It was just at the hour of the visitors who come down for the night from London. They were arriving thick and fast. The hall was very full, and there was a large party of Americans monopolizing most of the personnel. So I could not swear positively whether I did see Mr. Bedingfield or not then, though I'm quite sure that it was Mr. Timothy Bedingfield who dined and spent the evening with the Honorable Mr. de Grenville, as I know him quite well by sight. At 10 o'clock I'm off duty, and the night porter remains alone in the hall." Mr. Tremlett's evidence was corroborated in most respects by the waiter-nark of the hall porter. They had both seen the deceased come in at 7 o'clock in company with a gentleman. Their descriptions of the latter coincided with the appearance of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, whom, however, they did not actually know. At this point in the proceedings, the foreman of the jury wished to know why Mr. Timothy Bedingfield's evidence had not been obtained, and was informed by the detective inspector in charge of the case that the gentleman had seemingly left Birmingham, but was expected sometime shortly. The coroner suggested an adjournment pending Mr. Bedingfield's appearance, but at the earnest request of the detective he consented to hear the evidence of Peter Tyrrell, the night porter of the Castle Hotel, who, if you remember, case at all, succeeded in creating the biggest sensation of any which had been made through the extraordinary and weirdly gruesome case. It was the first time I had been on duty at the castle, he said, for I used to be a night porter at Brights and Wolverhampton. But just as I had come to duty at 10 o'clock, a gentleman came and asked if he could see the Honourable Robert de Guinevere. I said that I thought he was in, but would send up to see. The gentleman said, "It doesn't matter. Don't trouble. I know his room. 21, isn't it?" And up he went before I could say another. "Did he give you any name?" said the coroner. "No, sir." "What was he like?" "A young gentleman, sir, as far as I can remember. An Inverness cape and a Glengarry cap. But I could not see his face very well as he stood back in the lights, and the cap shaded his eyes. He only spoke to me for a minute." "Look around you," said the coroner quietly. "Is there anyone in this court who looks like the gentleman you speak of?" An odd hush fell over the many spectators that are present at Peter Tyrrell, the night porter of the Castle Hotel, turned his head towards the body of the court and slowly scanned the many faces there present. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. Only for a moment, though. Then was vaguely conscious of a terrible importance his next words might have. He shook his head gravely and said, "I wouldn't like to swear." Warner tried to press him. "With true British solidities," he repeated, "I wouldn't like to say." "Well, then, what happened?" asked the coroner, who had a preforce to abandon his points. "The gentleman went upstairs, sir, and about a quarter of an hour later he came down again, and I let him out. He was in a great hurry then, and he threw me a half-crown and said, 'Good night.'" "And though you saw him again, you cannot tell us you would know him?" Once more the hall porter's eyes wandered as if instinctively to a certain face in the court. Once more he hesitated for many seconds, which seems like so many hours during a man's honor. A man's life hung, perhaps, in the balance. Then Peter Tyrrell repeated slowly, "I wouldn't swear." But the coroner and the jury alike, aye, and every spectator in the crowded court, had seen the man's eyes had rested during that one moment of hesitation upon the face of the Earl of Broxley. Part 3. The man in the corner blinked with his funny, mild blue eyes. "No wonder you're puzzled," he continued. "So was everybody in the court that day, everyone save myself. I alone could see in my mind's eye with that gruesome murder which had been committed, with all its details and, above all, its motive, and such as you will see it presently, when I place it all clearly before you. Before this, you must see the daylights in the strange case. I must plunge you further into the darkness, in the same manner as the coroner and the jury were plunged into that following day. The second day of that quite remarkable inquest. I had it to be adjourned, since the appearance of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield had now become of vital importance. The public had come to regard his absence from Birmingham at this very critical moment to be decidedly remarkable, to say the least of it, and all those that did not know the lawyer by sight wished to see him, and his Inverness cape and Glengarry cap, such as he had appeared before the several witnesses of the night of the awful murder. When the coroner and the jury were seated, the first piece of information which the police placed before them was the astonishing statements that Mr. Timothy Bedingfield's whereabouts had not been ascertained, though it was confidentially expected that he had not gone far and could easily be traced. There was a witness present who, the police thought, might throw some light upon the lawyer's probable destination, for obviously he had left Birmingham directly after his interview with the deceased. This witness was Mrs. Higgins, who was Mr. Bedingfield's housekeeper. She stated that her master was in the constant habit, especially lately, of going up to London on business. He usually left by a late evening train on those occasions, and mostly was only absent 36 hours. He kept a portmanteau always ready packed for the purpose. He often left at a moment's notice. Mrs. Higgins added that her master stayed at the Great Western Hotel in London, for it was there that she was instructed to wire, if anything urgent required his presence in Birmingham. On the night of the 14th, she continued, at 9 o'clock or thereabouts, a messenger came to the door with the master's card, and said that he had been instructed to fetch Mr. Beddington's portmanteau, and then to meet him at the station in time to catch the 9:35 train up. I gave him the portmanteau, of course, and he had brought the card, and I had no idea where he could be anything wrong. But since then I heard nothing of my master, and I don't know when he will return. Questioned by the coroner, she added that Mr. Bedingfield had never stayed away quite so long without having his letters forwarded to him. There was a large pile waiting for him now. She had written to the Great Western Hotel, London, asking that she should do about the letters, but had received no reply. She did not know the messenger by sight who had been called by the portmanteau. Once or twice before, Mr. Bedingfield had sent for his things in that manner when he had been dining out. Mr. Bedingfield certainly wore his Inverness cape over his dress clothes, and when he went out about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, he also wore a Glengarry cap. The messenger had so far not been found. From this point, namely, the sending of the portmanteau, all traces of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield seemed to have been lost. Whether he went up to London by the 9:35 train or not could not be definitely ascertained. The police had questioned at least a dozen porters of the railway, as well as ticket collectors, but no one had had any special recollection of a gentleman in an Inverness cape and a Glengarry cap, a costume worn by more than one first-class passenger on a cold night in September. There was a hitch, you see. It all lay in this. Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer, had undoubtedly made himself scarce. He was last seen in the company of the deceased, wearing an Inverness cape and Glengarry cap. 2 or 3 witnesses saw him leaving the hotel at about 9:15. Then the messenger calls on the lawyer's house for the portmanteau, after which Mr. Timothy Bedingfield seems to have vanished into thin air. But, and that is a great but, the night porter at the castle seems to have seen someone wearing the momentous Inverness and Glengarry half an hour or so later, and going up to the deceased room, where he stayed about a quarter of an hour. Undoubtedly, you will say, as everyone said to themselves that day after the night porter and Mr. Higgins had been heard, that there was a very ugly and very black figure which pointed unpleasantly at Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, especially as that gentleman, for some reason which was required an explanation, was not there to put matters right for himself. But there was one little thing, a mere trifle perhaps, which neither the coroner nor the jury dared to overlook, for strictly speaking, it was not an evidence. You will remember that, when the night porter was asked if he could, among the persons present in the court, recognize the Honorable Robert Gineville's belated visitor, everyone had noticed his hesitation, and marked that man's eyes rested doubtingly upon the face of the figure of the young Earl of Brocklesby. Now, if the belated visitor had been Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, tall, lean, dry as dust, and a bird-like beak and clean-shaven chin, no one for a moment would have mistaken his face, even if they had only seen very casually or recollected it very dimly, with that of the Lord Brocklesby, who was florid and rather short. The only point in common between them was their Saxon hair. You see, that was a curious point, don't you? Added the man in the corner, who had now become so excited that his fingers worked like long, thin needles in and around this bit of string. It weighed very heavily in favor of Timothy Bedingfield, added to which you must also remember that, as far as he was concerned, the Honorable Robert de Benville was to him a goose with the golden eggs. The Honorable de Genneville peerage case had brought Bedingfield's name to great prominence. With the death of his claimants, hopes of prolonging the litigation came to an end. There was a total lack of motive so far as Bedingfield was concerned. Not so with the Earl of Brocklesby, I said. I've often maintained... What? Interrupted. That the Earl of Brockleton's changed his clothes with Bennington in order to more conveniently murder his own brother. Where and when can the exchange of costume have affected, considering the Inverness cape and the Glengarry cap were in the full of the Castle Hotel at 9:15, and at the hotel until 10 o'clock Lord Becklesby was at the Grand Hotel, finishing dinner with some friends. That was subsequently proven, remember, and also that he was back at Brocklesby Castle, which is 7 miles from Birmingham, at 11 o'clock sharp. Now, the visit of the individual in Glengarry occurred some time after 10 p.m. Then there was the disappearance of Bedingfield, I mused. Those certainly points very strong to him. He was very good at practice, I believe, and fairly well known. And yet see how simple it is, cried my friend. Only the police would not look further than these two men. Lord Brocklesby with the strong motive and the night porter's hesitation against him, and Bedingfield with the outer motive, but with the strong circumstantial evidence and his own disappearance as condemnatory signs. If only they would look at the case as I did, and think a little about the dead as well as the living. If they had remembered that the percentage of the peerage case of the Honourable Robert's debts is the last straw which proved the futile claim. Only that very day did the Earl of Brocklesby had, quietly showing the original ancient document to his brother, persuaded him how futile were his hopes. Who knows how many of the debts contracted, the promises made, and the money borrowed and obtained on the strength of the claim that were mere romance. It had nothing of but ruin, enmity of his brother, and the marriage probably broken off, a wasted life in fact. It is a small wonder, though ill feeling against the Earl of Brocklesby may have been deep. There was hatred, bitter, deadly hatred, against a man whose false promises had led him to a hopeless quagmire. Probably the Honourable Robert owed a great deal of money to Bedingfield, which he later hoped to recoup for the usurious interest, threats of scandals, and what-not. Think of all that, he added, then tell me if you believe that a stronger motive for the murder such an evil could be found. But what do you suggest is impossible? I said aghast. Allow me, he said. It is more than probable. It is very simple and very easy. The two men were alone together in the Honourable Robert Grenville's room after dinner. You, as representing the public, and the police say it's Bedingfield, went away and returned half an hour later in order to kill his client. I said that it was the lawyer who was murdered at 9 o'clock that evening, and that Robert the General, the ruined man and hopeless bankrupt, was the assailant. Then, of course, now you remember, for I have put you on track. The face and the body were battered and bruised, as they were past recognition. Both men were equal height. The hair, which could not alone be discolored or obscured, while both men were in similar color. Then the murderer proceeds to dress the victim in his own clothes. With the utmost care, he places his own rings on the fingers of the dead man, his own watch in the pocket, a gruesome task, but an important one, as though he thoroughly well done. Then he puts himself in the clothes of his victim, and finally the Inverness cape and Glengarry. When the hall is full of visitors, he slips out unperceived. He sends for messengers to Bennington's portmanteau and starts out for the night express. But then his visit to the Castle Hotel at 10 o'clock, I urged. How dangerous. Dangerous? Yes, but oh, how clever. You see, he is the Earl of Brocklesby's twin brother, and the twin brothers are always somewhat alike. He wished to appear dead, murdered by someone, he cared not by whom. But what he did not care about was to throw clouds of dust in the eyes of the police, and he succeeded with a vengeance. Perhaps, who knows, he wished to assure himself that he had forgotten nothing in his mise en scene, that the body, battered and bruised past all resemblance of human shape, save for its clothes, would really appear to everyone as the Honourable Robert Grenville, while the later disappeared forever from the old world and started a new life again. Then you must always reckon that the practical invariable rule of a murderer revisits scene, if only once the scene of his crime. 2 years have elapsed since the crime. No trace of Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer, has ever been found, and I can assure you that it will never be, for his plebeian body lies buried in the aristocratic family vault of the Earls of Brocklesby. He was gone as before. I could say another word. The faces of Timothy Bedingfield, of the Earl of Brocklesby, of the Honourable Robert de Genneville, seemed to dance before my eyes and to mock me, the hopelessness and bewilderment in which I had found myself plunged because of them. Then all the faces vanished, or rather, were merged into one long, thin, bird-like one, with bone-rimmed spectacles on the top of its beak, and a wide, rude grin beneath it, still plunged, still doubtful. I paid for any scanty luncheon that went my way.